I've seen many early access games come and go because they were sold on the promise of potential. Potential without execution. You can't run a studio on hopes and dreams and potential. Potential doesn't mean your game is good. Potential means your game is on its way to being good. Well guys, I tried. No, I didn't try playing Highguard. What, do you think I'm crazy? No, I tried being nice. For the first month of this year, I stayed on the sidelines being a good little consumer by not openly sharing my thoughts outside of an occasional tweet or comment, and just sit by to see how things pan out. And well, we got the train wreck that is Highguard. It's not to say I'm the most negative channel out there are plenty of other channels you can watch for that, but it's time for me to provide my genuine feedback on this whole situation, if just for the sake of my own sanity. First thing to mention, this is not the kind of game I'd expect from the developers who worked on Titanfall and Apex Legends. I know there are some similarities with the game having a hero shooter aspect, the weapons and the UI look like they were peeled right off of Apex Legends, and probably a few other examples here and there. However, the setting itself is another story. The setting is a loose fantasy setting with random sci-fi elements that doesn't really appear to mesh well with each other. We've seen other games like the Final Fantasy series be able to do this fairly well, with everything looking like it belongs in the world. And it's not to say that Highguard has to look like Final Fantasy, however, I don't really get the same kind of feel or effect. It feels more like a sandbox with random characters thrown in, without much reason. And I don't expect a PvP game to have a ton of story or background lore, but I can't even begin to tell you why these traits are happening in Highguard, what Highguard means, or is about, and what kind of technology exists in this world. But that's enough about the setting. It doesn't really matter if the game itself is worth playing. So what does Highguard offer? Well, it's a free-to-play hero shooter with a unique game mode. In short, it's a MOBA light. That's the best way I could classify this, a hero shooter MOBA light. Not a MOBA-like, but a MOBA light. And in my opinion, it's too light. In traditional MOBA games, you farm and mine for resources while fighting the enemy team, you go back to a shop to upgrade your character and abilities, then you rinse and repeat until one side gets the upper hand and wins the game. With Highguard, you mine for resources, you buy your weapon and loadout, and you fight. You try to capture a MacGuffin, then you basically end up playing Search and Destroy, with respawns on the final phase of the match, arming 2 or 3 bombs within the enemy base and making sure they blow up. Unfortunately for Highguard, the entire mode feels too shallow. Originally, it was a 3v3 game mode with large open maps. In a 3v3 setting, it's only going to take one team battle to determine who wins each phase of that match. To Wildlight's defense, they did add a 5v5 version of the mode, which they rightfully were praised for being able to add this mode very quickly. As for the MOBA aspects of this game, there's not really anything here other than mining for resources to buy a weapon. If there's any additional depth to that, I never saw it from the hours of gameplay I watched, between live streams and YouTube videos. You may correct me if I'm wrong on that front. There are a couple of issues the game itself also had, such as bad optimization and forced mouse acceleration. And that also meant having to dig into the game's files to try and change a few mouse and possibly a few graphic settings that aren't available within the game's menus. And 2 weeks after the game's launch, Wildlight had laid off a large number of developers from their team. Normally when this happens shortly after launch, this means the game is slowly spiraling down and will eventually crash and burn. There's always a chance that they somehow turn things around, but I highly doubt it. One of the people who were laid off was Josh Sobel. He posted a long tweet talking about his experience with launching Highguard, and it's honestly a good cautionary tale for future game developers, but probably not in the way that Josh was expecting. While someone who's far more patient than me can dissect this tweet for an hour, I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to focus on a few things here and there, and at least provide an alternative perspective from the outside looking in. In this tweet, Josh said he worked on this game for 2.5 years, and I believe it. I doubt Highguard was developed any longer than 3 years for how little the content the game offers, and with the optimization issues the game has that only requires 6 people for a full match. Immediately after that section, he talks about how anyone he knew who had any connection to the team or the project shared the same sentiments. This is lightning in a bottle. I could play this game all day. There's no way this will flop, etc, etc. He then goes on to say this. The internal pre-reveal feedback, even from unbiased sources, was quite positive, and where it was negative, it was constructive and often actionable. People who played the game, including us, had a blast. And since we were an independent, self-published studio built with royalties in mind, many of us were hoping this could finally be the thing that broke the millennial financial curse. There's a little bit to unpack there, so let's go ahead and talk about it. Internal feedback from developers and journalists will never give you the full picture of a PvP game. You're relying on journalists who are mostly average to below average players who won't try to abuse the game or play at a high level to see where the limitations are for the game. Sometimes that can be a good thing, like with Street Fighter 2, where the developers did not add a delay to every attack, which allowed players to chain multiple attacks together and create combos. From then on out, combos are a part of Street Fighter and many other fighting games. A lot of times, not having skilled players try out a PvP game can end up with unintentional game-breaking exploits. While it's easier today than ever to make a game that feels good to play, it's increasingly difficult to make a game that isn't going to have some toxic game-breaking meta at launch, or a game that people will want to continue playing week after week. Potentially, some of this feedback could be considered toxic positivity.
Toxic!
For instance, if I'm working on Highguard, am I going to risk my job to say what is wrong with this game? Am I willing to be the bad guy and say, hey, Concord flopped, there are a few glaring similarities with what we're doing, maybe we should change course, change the tone and the setting of the game, and adjust what we're doing so it's not as easy to compare our game to Concord? Am I willing to risk my job and say that? Or will I just shut up and say, yeah, the game's coming along nicely, keep working on the game, and enjoy the stable income until the release of the game and hope everything works out? I think this is an issue every studio needs to work out, both AAA and AA studios who have veteran developers who may need a little bit of humility and a little bit of direction to make a better overall game. That can't really happen if developers are at risk of either being labeled as a villain, toxic, and having all of their feedback be ignored by those who are in charge. I'm not saying this is what happened specifically with Highguard. However, it's really hard for me to believe no one at Wildlight saw this coming until the game was revealed in the Game Awards. Speaking of the Game Awards, going back to Josh Sobel's tweet, I'm sure it was jarring to only be given mostly positive feedback behind closed doors, to receiving overwhelmingly negative feedback on Twitter, YouTube, and online forums. Unfortunately, with how the internet works, social media only pushes extreme options, because that's what gets the most engagement. I think I posted some level-headed comments on one or two YouTube videos, but those get lost in the void. People would rather try and shock you or rage bait you with their posts than try to provide actual feedback. By no means should Josh or any developer be receiving death threats for making this game. Social media tends to feed lunatics who have zero filter, and I don't condone it. Believe me, I'm just as frustrated with that as Josh and many other developers are. Why is that? Because I can't make videos or posts that are labeled with a balanced title. It has to be an extreme in one direction or the other, just to get people to see what I have to say. It sucks, but I don't see that changing anytime soon. According to Josh, there was plenty of positive feedback behind closed doors, and even with a peak player count of 100,000 players, the game itself was not compelling enough to make those people stick around. At some point, you have to stop blaming gaming culture and realize that people did give your game a shot, and unfortunately, most people did not get hooked on it. Good games don't die just because of word of mouth. Marvel Rivals got a lot of heat when it first released. Since then, it's been going head to head against Overwatch every step of the way. The game itself was far greater than any negative feedback the internet could throw at it. Now, even with all the negative press, Highguard could have continued to limp onward. However, that's not likely to happen for much longer. Looking at another game, the Finals, it's able to hold a consistent player base of 10 to 15,000 concurrent players every single day, which isn't a large number compared to the Juggernauts, but it's large enough to keep the lights on, course correct, add new content, and try to find a way to make the game more successful over time. Highguard, on the other hand, is averaging about 2,000 players. I don't need to be a mathematician to see what will happen next. And now we get to the part that I think I disagree the most with Josh Sobel. Josh then goes into this rant about players not giving new, innovative PvP games a chance, which I already said, we had the Finals, and that's still running around and doing pretty well. And in terms of this game, all Highguard did was add a mining element to a hero shooter, make a 3-phase game mode that feels like a 2-phase game mode most times, at least from watching it, and that's about it. It's not to say the game itself could never work. It's not to say the mode itself could never work. But the setting, hero abilities, none of that had any wow factor or huge innovation that we can't find in any other game. Deadlock has more innovation as a third-person MOBA with a rail system to get you to and from the battlefield, unique characters and abilities that feel fun and rewarding to play. And that game has only started to show up. Marvel Rivals has more innovation than Highguard, with how they're constantly adding new game modes like a zombies mode or an auto battler, and nothing new that sets the world on fire, but it is a new way to play the game whenever you're tired of the main game mode. And going back to the finals, that has more innovation and is honestly the best game I would use to compare to Highguard. I would consider the finals to be a hero shooter. However, it does focus more on the shooter aspect and the roles are not clearly defined. You can be a heavy tank player that can heal and deal a ton of damage. You can be a long-range sniper with a light class or an up-close assassin. With every character having access to 3 or 4 gadgets and a ton of lethal weaponry, it provides a ton of flexibility and structure to what should end up being a complete mess of a game. I myself have some issues with how the weapons in the finals are balanced, but if it wasn't for that, I'd still be playing that game every single day. I haven't even mentioned the amounts of destruction the finals offers, which is a big selling point in and of the game itself. Meanwhile, in Highguard, you break a few stationary walls, and that's it. So no, Highguard was not innovative, not in a way that is tangible and actually matters to the overall gameplay loop. Honestly, for me, I don't know how new development studios aren't looking at Arc Raiders, Helldivers, or the finals and think, yeah, we should look into making something like that. If I had it my way, I'd tell development teams to even look back at games from 2006, 2007, 2008, and so on. There are plenty of ideas for smaller games that would be easier to manage and develop than to try to swing for the fences and make the next live service, hero shooter, extraction shooter, or battle royale. It always seems like even in Hollywood and in game development, a lot of these studios are trying to skip all of the grunt work to try and make the next big thing. When in reality, when you look at old games, we don't really see them take off until the second or third game. We all like and enjoy Halo, but for most players, if you ask them which one is their favorite, they're probably going to say Halo 2 or Halo 3. A lot of people really enjoy Call of Duty, but if you're going to ask which one they enjoyed the most, they're going to say the original Modern Warfare 2, the original Black Ops, the original Black Ops 2. They're not going to say the very first Call of Duty game that ever came out. They're not going to say Halo 1. They're always going to look back at the sequel that actually improved upon the original game, and then everyone builds off of that. If you're a brand new studio with a very limited budget and you're trying to swing for the fences for a live service, I would say don't, and instead make a smaller version of the game that you want to make it compact, make it easy to sustain, and either work on top of the game that you made or then work on a full-fledged sequel, and a sequel that is still true to the original game you developed. Going back on topic, when I saw this was the final nail in the coffin for Highguard. When you even have people from IGN calling Highguard a rough draft. I'll read off a couple of sentences here and there from that review. Highguard's compelling gunplay, impressive pace of updates, and killer raid mode have made its exciting attack and defend encounters quite memorable, even if the version we have right now feels a bit like a rough draft. And then moving on to the final sentence. And I can already feel the makings of something that could be pretty stellar if it's able to survive long enough to fully realize that potential. If you've been following any gaming channel or podcast that talks about video games often, there's a word there that should stick out to you. Potential. Potential, potential, potential. So many games are labeled with this word, and while a game with potential may be able to withhold a small audience, it doesn't normally hold that audience for long. I've seen many early access games come and go because they were sold on the promise of potential. Potential without execution. You can't run a studio on hopes and dreams and potential. Not for long anyways. Yeah, unless your game is Star Citizen, but I digress. Potential doesn't mean your game is good. Potential means your game is on its way to being good. The patience people have to wait for a game with potential to be good, it's mostly over. Unless the core gameplay is so compelling and unique, people have to play your game. Like we've seen with Escape from Tarkov, as it was the only extraction shooter in the market for years. And now, I would argue Arc Raiders has taken over as the most popular extraction shooter. You kind of need a solid project out the gate that can hold its own. And in the case of Highguard, it fell a few miles short of that gate. I think it's too late for Wildlight to make any kind of change that can bring players back. The gaming market is impatient and unforgiving. I'd love to see XDefiant and Splitgate have a large enough audience to stick around. Unfortunately, both games suffered for different reasons, and it seems like Splitgate is probably on its way out as well. Thank you for getting this far in the video. Let me know what your thoughts are on Highguard and whether you think it could have survived longer if the release was done differently. Don't forget to like this video, consider sharing this video around, and subscribing to the channel. Any support is greatly appreciated, as YouTube has buried my channel since September of last year. Until then, I am Mr. Rain, and I'll see you next time.